Wedding day became her public humiliation when the king looked her in the eyes and declared before the entire court, "I will never love you." Cast aside as nothing more than a vessel for heirs, the new queen's tears fall silently behind closed doors until she discovers two small children hiding in the shadows of the castle. Neglected, forbidden, and bearing the unmistakable features of the man who rejected her, these royal bastards exist as ghosts in their own home. What begins as a moment of shared pain transforms into a dangerous secret as the queen smuggles food from her table and whispers of kindness in the night. But in a court where every glance is noted and every alliance questioned, how long before someone notices? And when the king discovers this forbidden connection, will he destroy the fragile bonds formed between three broken souls, or will he finally confront the meaning of family, loyalty, and being chosen despite one's flaws? A letter appears, written in a child's unsteady hand. 3 simple words that could change everything, or cost them everything. Her heart stopped beating for 3 agonizing seconds as the great oak doors of the castle hall swung open. The sudden silence that fell over the crowd felt like a physical blow. Hundreds of eyes turning to judge, to mock, to pity. Alara's throat closed, her fingers trembling against the coarse fabric of the hastily mended dress the servants had thrown at her that morning. A dress that screamed what everyone already knew. She was unworthy. The torchlight flickered mercilessly, exposing every imperfection in her appearance. A servant's daughter, then a soldier's widow, now forced to become a queen. The absurdity of it made her stomach twist into knots. Whispers cut through the silence like daggers. Peasant bride, desperate choice, political necessity. Each word a tiny wound that would never fully heal. The vast stone hall suddenly seemed to shrink around her. Sweat gathered at the nape of her neck despite the autumn chill. The smell of beeswax candles mingled with perfumed nobles and unwashed commoners admitted to witness this mockery of a royal wedding. Her mouth went dry as sandpaper as she took the first step forward, then another, her borrowed shoes scraping against the stone floor with each movement. The sound echoed, emphasizing her isolation in this sea of hostile faces. A nobleman to her left curled his lip in disgust, turning away as if she carried disease. A lady giggled behind her fan, eyes gleaming with cruel amusement. The court jester's usual smile had twisted into something that resembled pity, perhaps the most unbearable reaction of all. Alara forced herself to keep her chin lifted, though her neck muscles ached with the effort. Each heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out everything except the whispers that seemed to grow louder with every step. "They say the king needs an heir quickly. Any woman with a womb would do, it seems. Poor thing doesn't realize she's just a vessel." Her fingernails dug crescents into her palms as she approached the dais where he stood. King Aldrich, tall, handsome, and regarding her with the same interest one might show a piece of furniture. No warmth touched his gray eyes. No gentle encouragement softened his features. The air between them crackled with tension, not desire. This was a transaction, nothing more. When he finally moved toward her, Alara's breath caught. For one foolish moment, some desperate part of her heart hoped for kindness, for the slightest acknowledgement of her humanity. Instead, he reached for her hand with visible reluctance, his fingers barely brushing her skin as if touching something soiled. The contact sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the drafty hall. "Let us be done with this quickly," he muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Her lungs forgot how to draw air. The priest began the ceremony, his words blurring together as Alara fought to remain standing. The crown they placed upon her head weighed like a millstone, threatening to snap her neck. When she stole a glance at her husband-to-be, his profile remained rigid, jaw clenched in barely concealed disgust. Then came the moment that would haunt her dreams for months to come. As the priest concluded the blessing, King Aldrich turned to address the court, his voice cutting through the hall with brutal clarity. "Let it be known that this marriage is one of necessity, not choice. I will never love her. She is merely a means to secure the bloodline when all suitable options have been exhausted." The words struck Alara like physical blows, each syllable hammered into her chest, shattering what little dignity she had managed to preserve. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by uncomfortable shifting. Even in a political marriage, such public cruelty was unexpected. The humiliation burned through her veins like poison. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Not here, not in front of them. She swallowed the knot in her throat, tasting blood where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. The ring they exchanged felt like a shackle, the metal cold against her skin. No kiss sealed their union, merely a curt nod from the king before he stepped away, putting distance between them even as the ceremony proclaimed them one. As they processed out, maintaining the facade of matrimonial dignity, Alara felt the weight of every stare. The king walked several paces ahead, making clear his desire for separation even in this first public appearance. Her new crown sat awkwardly, too large for her head, just as this role was too large for her soul. The invisible chains of this arrangement tightened around her with each step. It was then, as they approached the great doors leading to the feast hall, that she noticed them, two small figures partially hidden behind a massive stone column. Children, thin and dressed in clothes too simple for the royal court. A boy and a girl, perhaps 8 and 6 years old, with eyes that reflected a familiar pain. Their gazes locked with hers for just a moment, but in that instant, Alara felt something pass between them, recognition of shared suffering. The boy clutched his sister's hand protectively, his knuckles white with effort. The girl's eyes were red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying. But it wasn't their appearance that made Alara's heart stutter. It was their features, the sharp cheekbones, the distinctive shape of their eyes, the proud set of their small shoulders. Features unmistakably like those of the man who had just publicly rejected her. As quickly as she noticed them, they vanished, slipping into the shadows as servants rushed to open doors for the royal procession. Alara nearly stumbled, her mind racing with questions. Who were these children? Why were they watching from hiding rather than seated with the court? And why did their eyes hold such profound sadness? A sadness that seemed directed not at her, but for her. The feast that followed was a blur of faces and forced smiles. The king sat far from her, laughing with courtiers as if celebrating his freedom rather than his wedding. Alara picked at food she couldn't taste, answered questions with words she wouldn't remember, and felt the weight of her new reality settling over her like a shroud. She was a queen in name only, unwanted, unloved, and utterly alone in a castle full of strangers who despised her very presence. That night, as she lay in her separate chamber, the king had made it clear there would be no consummation until necessary. Alara finally allowed her tears to fall. Yet even as sorrow washed over her, the image of those two children remained fixed in her mind. Their eyes haunted her, filled with a pain that mirrored her own. Who were they? And why did she feel, in some inexplicable way, that their fates were intertwined with hers in this cold and loveless castle? The first rays of morning sunlight pierced through the narrow window of Alara's chamber, but brought no warmth. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding, yet each day felt like a repetition of the same hollow existence. She traced her fingers along the cold stone wall as she walked, the rough texture a reminder of the unyielding reality of her new life. The silence that followed her through the winding corridors was broken only by her own footsteps, echoing like accusations against the stone floors. Servants scurried away at her approach, their eyes downcast, but not before she caught flickers of disdain. They bowed, a formality as empty as her title, then whispered once they thought she couldn't hear. But the castle carried sounds in strange ways, and fragments reached her ears nonetheless. Poor king, saddled with a commoner. They say he hasn't even visited her chambers. How long before he sets her aside? A sudden chill ran down Alara's spine that had nothing to do with the perpetual draft. She paused, her hand trembling slightly against a tapestry depicting some ancient battle. Behind the heavy fabric, muffled laughter reached her ears, female laughter, intimate and knowing. Her stomach tightened as she recognized a deeper voice responding. The king's voice, warm in a way she had never heard directed at her. The sound of fabric rustling, of bodies moving together was unmistakable. Alara's throat constricted, not from jealousy, but from humiliation. Her presence here was so insignificant that they didn't even bother hiding their trysts properly. She was not merely unloved, she was forgotten entirely. She hurried away, her face burning despite the cold air, and found herself in a part of the castle she had not yet explored. The dining hall stood vast and empty when she entered for her midday meal. The table, long enough to seat 50, was set with a single plate at the far end. The isolation was deliberate, a daily reminder of her position. While the king hosted lavish feasts in the great hall, she ate alone, served by the most junior staff who couldn't hide their resentment at being assigned to the unwanted queen. "Will His Majesty be joining me today?" she asked the servant, though she already knew the answer. "The king is occupied with matters of state," came the rehearsed reply, delivered with eyes that never quite met hers. The lie hung in the air between them, both knowing exactly how the king was occupied. The servant placed a bowl of thin soup before her and retreated to the shadows. Ilara stared at her distorted reflection in the silver spoon, a queen who ate alone while her husband entertained mistresses openly, a crown without power, a marriage without even the pretense of respect. The soup turned bitter in her mouth. That afternoon, seeking escape from the suffocating walls, she ventured into the castle gardens. Rain had fallen earlier, leaving the stone paths slick and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. The roses were in bloom, their perfume almost too sweet, too perfect for this place of hidden cruelties. She seated herself on a bench partially hidden by overgrown hedges, finally allowing her shoulders to slump, freed from the constant need to appear dignified. A twig snapped nearby. Ilara straightened immediately, the brief moment of vulnerability shattered. Her heart raced as she scanned the garden, expecting to find one of the court ladies come to mock her solitude. Instead, she caught a glimpse of a small figure ducking behind a stone fountain, a child's movement, quick and practiced in the art of not being seen. "You needn't hide," she called softly, surprising herself with the gentle invitation. "I won't tell anyone you're here." For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, hesitantly, a small face peered around the fountain, the boy she had seen at the wedding, his eyes wide with a caution that no child should need to possess. Behind him appeared his sister, clinging to his tunic with one hand. They approached with the wariness of woodland creatures, ready to bolt at the slightest threat. Up close, their resemblance to the king was even more striking. The same high forehead, the same proud set to their chins. But where his eyes were cold, theirs held a wary warmth, a desperate hope that made Ilara's chest ache. "Are you truly the queen now?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "So they tell me," Ilara replied with a sad smile, "though I'm not certain anyone believes it." The boy studied her face intently. "They don't let us attend court functions. We're supposed to stay in the East Wing with Matron Agnes." "And who are you?" Ilara asked, though a growing suspicion was forming in her mind, one that explained both their features and their furtive behavior. Before they could answer, a sharp voice cut through the garden. "Your Majesty, what are you doing with those children?" Lady Beatrice, one of the king's closest confidants, strode toward them, her face a mask of calculated concern. The children froze like rabbits before a wolf. The boy pushed his sister behind him protectively, his small body tensing for whatever punishment might follow. "I was merely enjoying the garden," Ilara replied, rising to her full height, which still fell short of the imposing lady. "As were these children." "Those children," Lady Beatrice said with unmistakable venom, "are not to be wandering the grounds, and you, Your Majesty, would do well to remember your place." "My place?" Ilara echoed, a rare spark of defiance kindling within her. "As a vessel for the royal lineage," the woman replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Nothing more. The king has made that abundantly clear, has he not?" The barb found its mark. Ilara felt the children's eyes on her, witnessing her humiliation. She would not give Lady Beatrice the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. "Thank you for your concern," Ilara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'll remember it." Lady Beatrice grabbed both children roughly by their arms. "These two are returning to their quarters, and I suggest you return to yours." As they were dragged away, the little girl looked back over her shoulder, her expression a mixture of fear and something else, something that resembled longing. Alara stood motionless in the garden long after they'd gone, the encounter replaying in her mind. Those children, hidden away like shameful secrets, their furtive movements, their familiar features. The pieces assembled themselves into a picture she should have seen from the beginning. That night, sleep eluded her. She paced her chamber, the stone floor cold against her bare feet. Outside her window, rain began to fall again, pattering against the glass in an irregular rhythm that matched her troubled thoughts. In the distance, she could hear music and laughter from the great hall, another feast from which she had been deliberately excluded. A soft knock at her door startled her. No one ever visited her chambers, especially not at this hour. She hesitated, then called, "Enter." The door creaked open just enough for two small figures to slip inside. Soaked from the rain, trembling with cold or fear or both, the children stood before her, their eyes huge in their pale faces. "Forgive us, Your Majesty," the boy said, his voice steadier than his body. "We had to see you." "They'll punish you if they find you here," Ilara whispered, already moving to fetch a blanket for their shivering forms. "They punish us anyway," the girl replied with a simplicity that broke Ilara's heart. "At least this way, we choose why." As she wrapped the blanket around their shoulders, the boy looked up at her with eyes too old for his young face. "We're his children," he said, confirming what she had already guessed. "His bastards. Our mothers are gone." "And no one cares for you?" Ilara asked, though the answer was written in their neglected appearance, in the caution with which they moved through the world. The girl leaned against her, a trust so unexpected that Ilara nearly wept. "No one sees us," she whispered, "until you did." In that moment, something shifted within Ilara, a realization that her pain was not unique. These children, carrying the blood of the man who had humiliated her, were perhaps the only souls in this castle who truly understood what it meant to be unwanted. As she held them close, their small bodies gradually warming under her care, she felt for the first time since entering this cold castle something akin to purpose. Footsteps in the corridor outside froze them all. The children tensed, preparing to flee, but it was too late. The handle of her door was already turning. The door handle stopped mid-turn. For 3 heartbeats, time itself seemed suspended. Ilara instinctively pushed the children behind her skirts, her body becoming a shield between them and whoever stood on the other side. The footsteps paused, then continued down the corridor, fading into blessed silence. "A patrol guard," whispered the boy, his breath warm against Ilara's hand. "They check the halls every hour after midnight." The tension drained from her shoulders, leaving behind a trembling awareness of how close they'd come to discovery. She guided the children to sit by the small hearth where embers still glowed faintly. In the dim light, their features seemed even more pronounced. The king's nose, the king's jawline, but softened by youth and vulnerability. "You know who we are," the boy said, pulling the blanket tighter around his sister. It wasn't a question. Ilara nodded, kneeling before them on the cold stone floor. "The king's children, but not the queen's. There was no queen before you," the girl said, her voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. "Only mothers who disappeared." A chill crept up Ilara's spine that had nothing to do with the drafty chamber. "Disappeared." The boy's eyes darkened. "They told us our mothers left, abandoned us, but I remember mine. She wouldn't have left willingly." His words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ilara's throat tightened as pieces of an ugly puzzle began to fit together. The king's reputation for cruelty extended beyond his public humiliation of her. What happened to women who bore him children outside of marriage? Women who might become inconvenient? "How many of you are there?" she asked softly. "Just us now," the girl whispered. "There were others, but they're gone too." "I'm Thomas," the boy said suddenly, as if needing to assert his identity in a world that preferred to keep him nameless. "She's Eleanor. We're half-siblings, different mothers." Eleanor reached out a small hand to touch Ilara's cheek. The unexpected tenderness of the gesture made Ilara's eyes sting with unshed tears. "You're not like the others," Eleanor said. "You see us. The servants feed us scraps," Thomas continued, his voice strengthening with each word. "They let us sleep in the storage rooms near the kitchen when it's cold. Matron Agnes beats us if we're seen by important visitors. We're supposed to be invisible. Ilara's heart constricted painfully in her chest. These children, the king's own flesh and blood, treated worse than stray dogs, hidden away like shameful secrets while their father feasted and laughed just floors below. Her own humiliation suddenly seemed less significant compared to their ongoing suffering. "How old are you?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I'm 8, Thomas replied. "Eleanor's 6. Our birthdays are never celebrated, but I keep count of the seasons. 8 and 6, so young to have endured so much." Ilara reached out, hesitating only briefly before smoothing back Thomas's unruly hair. He stiffened at first, then leaned into her touch like a starving creature offered food. "Our father doesn't want us," Eleanor said, her voice flat with acceptance rather than self-pity. "He says bastards bring only trouble. But he keeps us here," Thomas added bitterly. "Says we're still of his blood, so we can't be let loose in the world to cause scandal. Imprisoned, then. Not out of care, but out of control." Ilara thought of her own position, a queen in name only, kept for appearance and necessity rather than desire. Different circumstances, yet the same fundamental truth. They were all possessions of a man who viewed people as either useful or inconvenient. "Were you ever afraid?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "When they told you you'd marry the king?" The question pierced through Ilara's carefully constructed facade. No one had asked about her feelings before. Not the matchmakers who arranged the union, not the servants who prepared her for the wedding, certainly not the king himself. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I was terrified. I still am." Thomas nodded solemnly. "We're always afraid, too." Those 5 simple words formed a bridge between them, a shared understanding that transcended age and circumstance. In that moment, Ilara recognized that these children had sought her out, not just for comfort or curiosity, but because they recognized a kindred spirit. Another soul trapped in the king's web of power and indifference. "They say cruel things about you," Thomas said, watching her reaction carefully. "The servants, the nobles. They laugh because the king humiliated you at the wedding." Ilara's cheeks burned with remembered shame, but she held his gaze steadily. "Yes, they're cruel to us too," Eleanor whispered. "They say we're worthless, stains on the royal name." "They're wrong," Ilara said fiercely, surprising herself with the sudden surge of protectiveness. "About all of us." The children exchanged glances, a silent communication born of years surviving together. "Will you send us away now?" Thomas asked, bracing himself for rejection. Instead, Ilara reached into a small cupboard by her bedside and pulled out half a loaf of bread she'd saved from her dinner. Breaking it into pieces, she offered it to them, watching as they tried, and failed, to hide their hunger. "I won't send you away," she said softly, "and I won't tell anyone you came." They ate with the careful efficiency of those accustomed to making every crumb count. Eleanor's small fingers gathered even the tiniest pieces from her lap. When they finished, Thomas straightened his shoulders with renewed determination. "We should go. Matron Agnes checks the sleeping quarters at dawn. If she finds us missing..." He didn't need to finish. The threat hung silently between them. "Come again tomorrow night," Ilara said impulsively. "I'll keep food for you." Hope flickered across their faces, so bright and fragile that it made her heart ache. But Thomas, ever cautious, frowned. "It's dangerous. Lady Beatrice watches you closely. She's the king's..." He stopped, searching for a word appropriate for his sister's ears. "I know what she is," Ilara assured him, "but we'll be careful." Eleanor slipped her small hand into Ilara's. "You promise? You won't forget about us tomorrow?" The question carried the weight of previous broken promises, of learned distrust. Ilara squeezed the tiny hand gently. "I promise. I won't forget you." After they slipped away, 2 shadows moving with practiced stealth through the castle corridors, Ilara sat alone on her bed, mind racing with all she'd learned. The king's bastard children, hidden away like living ghosts. The mysterious disappearances of their mothers. Her own precarious position as an unloved queen. For the first time since her arrival, she felt something beyond despair and resignation. These children had awakened a protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. They needed her, perhaps as much as she needed them. In a castle full of people who saw her as nothing but a vessel for producing heirs, Thomas and Eleanor saw her as a person. In their eyes, she wasn't the humiliated bride or the peasant queen. She was simply someone who had shown them kindness. Dawn was breaking when Alara finally fell into a fitful sleep, her dreams filled with children running through endless corridors, always just out of reach. When she woke hours later, she wondered briefly if the night's encounter had been merely a dream born of loneliness. But the crumbs on her floor and the lingering impression of small fingers in hers confirmed the truth. She had made a promise. And in a life where she controlled almost nothing, this at least was her choice to make. As she dressed for another day of isolation and whispers, Alara's thoughts turned to the evening ahead. She would need to be clever, finding ways to save food without arousing suspicion, creating excuses to be alone in her chambers at night. The risk was considerable, if Lady Beatrice discovered her connection to the children. Yet the risk seemed insignificant compared to the memory of Eleanor's hopeful face and Thomas's protective stance. For the first time since entering this castle, Alara had found something worth fighting for. She couldn't change her fate as the king's unwanted wife, but perhaps she could change theirs. Lady Beatrice's lips curled into a smile that never reached her eyes as she approached Alara in the castle's dimly lit corridor. The torchlight cast elongated shadows across the stone walls, making the lady's elegant figure appear unnaturally tall and menacing. 4 servants trailed behind her, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes watchful. "Your Majesty," Lady Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How peculiar to find you wandering these hallways again. One might think you were searching for something." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her expression neutral. The small bundle of bread and cheese hidden in her sleeve suddenly felt conspicuous, though she knew it couldn't be seen. 2 weeks had passed since she'd begun meeting with Thomas and Eleanor, each night a delicate dance of secrecy and whispered conversations. "I find walking helps clear my thoughts," Alara replied, grateful that her voice remained steady. "The Queen's chambers can feel rather confining." "Indeed." Lady Beatrice's gaze slid over Alara's simple dress with undisguised contempt. "Though one would think you'd be accustomed to modest accommodations, given your background." The barb was intended to wound, to remind Alara of her common origins. Instead, it strengthened her resolve. She thought of the children waiting in her chambers, of Thomas's solemn eyes and Eleanor's quiet trust. For them, she would endure any insult. "If you'll excuse me," Alara said with a slight bow of her head, "I should return to those modest accommodations." "Good evening, Lady Beatrice." She made to move past, but Lady Beatrice shifted slightly, blocking her path. "The servants have noticed curious things lately," she said, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "Food disappearing from the kitchens, strange noises from the Queen's chambers after dark." Her eyes snapped up to meet Alara's. The king would be most displeased to learn his new wife was engaging in suspicious activities. Ice flooded Alara's veins. Did she know about the children? Or was this merely a fishing expedition, hoping to catch Alara in some admission of guilt? "I've always had a hearty appetite," Alara replied, forcing a light tone. "A peasant habit I've yet to break, I'm afraid." Lady Beatrice's nostrils flared slightly, the only indication that Alara's casual acknowledgement of her own background had caught her off guard. She had expected shame, not acceptance. "Just remember your purpose here, Your Majesty," Lady Beatrice said, voice hardening. "You are to provide an heir and nothing more. The king has made his feelings quite clear, I believe." The memory of the king's public declaration flooded back. "I will never love her." Alara's cheeks burned, but she held Lady Beatrice's gaze. "He has indeed made himself perfectly clear," she replied. "Now, if you'll excuse me." This time Lady Beatrice stepped aside, but her eyes followed Alara down the corridor with the focused intensity of a predator tracking prey. By the time Alara reached her chambers, her hands were trembling. Thomas and Eleanor were already there, huddled near the hearth, their faces lighting up at her arrival. The sight of them, these children who had no one else in the world, steadied her nerves. "We thought you weren't coming," Thomas said, relief evident in his voice. "Lady Beatrice delayed me," Ilara explained, carefully closing the heavy door behind her. She withdrew the food from her sleeve and handed it to them, watching as they divided it with practiced fairness. I think she suspects something. Thomas froze mid-bite. She can't know about us. If the king finds out, he won't, Ilara assured him, though the promise felt hollow even as she spoke it. We'll be more careful, that's all. Eleanor, picking up on the tension, pressed against Ilara's side. Are we causing trouble for you? The simple question, asked with such genuine concern, made Ilara's throat tighten. These children, who had known nothing but rejection and cruelty, were worried about her welfare. You could never be trouble to me, she said, smoothing Eleanor's tangled hair. Never. As they ate, Thomas told her stories of their day, how they'd found a hidden passage behind the kitchens, how Eleanor had befriended a stray cat in the courtyard, how they'd overheard two cooks gossiping about court scandals, small adventures that constituted their secret lives within the castle walls. Eleanor yawned, her small body curling trustingly against Ilara's side. Before long, she had drifted to sleep, her breathing deep and even. She hasn't slept this peacefully in months, Thomas observed quietly. Not since they moved us from the east wing to the servants' quarters. Why did they move you? Ilara asked. Thomas's expression darkened. A visiting dignitary was given our rooms. The king said we weren't worth the space anymore. Anger flared in Ilara's chest, hot and unexpected. He's wrong, she said fiercely. You're worth everything. The boy studied her face, searching for signs of insincerity. Finding none, he asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him. Why are you kind to us? We're his children. The children of the man who humiliated you. Ilara considered the sleeping girl against her side, the cautious boy watching her so intently. Because you're not him, she said finally. You're yourselves. And because... She hesitated, then admitted the truth. Because I was lonely too. Thomas nodded solemnly. We belong together then, he said, with the simple clarity of childhood. The ones nobody wants. The words were like an arrow to Ilara's heart, painfully accurate yet somehow comforting in their honesty. She reached out, tentatively touching Thomas's shoulder, and felt him lean into the contact. Yes, she whispered. We belong together. Morning came too quickly. The children slipped away before dawn, leaving Ilara alone with her thoughts and the lingering warmth of their presence. She moved through her day in a fog of worry and determination, hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered comment. The rumors spread by Lady Beatrice worked quickly. Servants who had previously ignored Ilara now watched her with suspicious eyes. A handmaiden accidentally spilled water on her dress during dressing. The steward questioned her requests for extra food with barely concealed disdain. By midday, she was summoned to the throne room. The king sat alone, idly turning a goblet in his hands as she entered. He didn't stand when she approached, nor did he acknowledge her customary curtsy. His face, handsome but cold, revealed nothing of his thoughts. Lady Beatrice tells me you've been behaving oddly, he said without preamble. Ilara clasped her hands to stop them from shaking. I wasn't aware that walking in my own home was considered odd behavior, Your Majesty. His eyes narrowed at her tone. This isn't your home, he corrected sharply. It's my castle. You are here for one purpose only. To provide an heir, Ilara said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Yes, I recall the terms of our arrangement quite clearly. The king studied her with newfound interest, as if seeing her properly for the first time. You've developed quite a spine since our wedding day, he observed. I don't recall such spirit when you stood trembling before me at the altar. Perhaps I've found something worth having spirit for, she replied, instantly regretting the words. He leaned forward, suddenly alert. And what might that be, I wonder? What could possibly give my unwanted bride such courage? Before she could respond, the doors to the throne room burst open. Lady Beatrice swept in, triumph evident in her face. Behind her, two guards dragged Thomas and Eleanor, their small faces bruised and terrified. Found in the Queen's chambers, Your Majesty, Lady Beatrice announced with vicious satisfaction. Your bastards hiding like rats. The blood drained from Ilara's face as she watched Thomas struggle against the guard's grip. Eleanor had gone completely still, her eyes wide with terror. The king rose slowly from his throne, his expression thunderous. "What is the meaning of this?" Lady Beatrice's smile was venomous. "It seems your queen has been harboring these embarrassments, feeding them, comforting them." She spat the last word as if it were obscene. "Using them, no doubt, in some scheme." "Is this true?" the king demanded, turning to Ilara. She looked from his furious face to the children's frightened ones and found her voice. "They were hungry," she said simply, "and alone." The king's face contorted with rage. "So you took it upon yourself to interfere with matters that don't concern you." "They're children," Ilara said, her voice growing stronger. "Children who deserve kindness." "They're bastards," he snarled. "Mistakes, evidence of weakness." Eleanor whimpered at his words, and something in Ilara snapped. She stepped forward, placing herself between the king and the children. "They're your blood," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "And they have names, Thomas and Eleanor. They're innocent children who deserve better than to be treated as shameful secrets." The throne room fell silent. The king's face had gone rigid with fury. "Take them back to their quarters," he ordered the guards, "and summon the court. I will deal with this insubordination publicly." As the guards dragged the struggling children away, Thomas managed to break free for just a moment. He ran to Ilara, pressing something into her hand before they pulled him back. "Get out," the king commanded Ilara, his voice deadly quiet. "Prepare yourself. In 1 hour you will learn what happens to those who defy me." After they had all gone, Ilara opened her hand. Inside lay a crudely drawn picture on a scrap of parchment, 3 figures holding hands, 2 small, 1 tall, a family of the unwanted, drawn by children's hands. For the first time since her wedding day, Ilara wept openly, clutching the drawing to her heart. The great hall had been transformed into a theater of humiliation. Nobles lined the walls, their finery a mockery of the solemnity of the occasion, their eyes hungry for scandal. Ilara stood in the center, alone, as the king's voice echoed from his elevated throne. Her hands were clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling, the small parchment drawing safely hidden in the folds of her sleeve. "Behold your queen," the king announced, his tone dripping with contempt. "Not content with her station, she has taken to consorting with bastards and servants, undermining the very foundation of this court." Whispers rippled through the assembly. Some faces showed shock, others thinly veiled glee at her downfall. Lady Beatrice stood at the king's right hand, triumph gleaming in her eyes like polished stones. "I have sheltered children who needed care," Ilara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Nothing more." "Silence!" The king's fist came down hard on the arm of his throne. "You were brought here for one purpose, to provide legitimate heirs to this kingdom. Instead, you waste your sympathies on those who have no place here." And from the shadows at the edge of the hall, Ilara caught a glimpse of Thomas and Eleanor, held firmly by guards, but positioned so they could witness her disgrace. Thomas's face was a mask of guilt and fear, while Eleanor's eyes brimmed with tears she was too frightened to shed. The sight of them, so small against the armored men who restrained them, kindled something fierce within Ilara's chest. "They have every right to be here," she said, raising her voice so it carried throughout the hall. "They carry your blood, your majesty." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. No one spoke to the king this way, especially not his unwanted bride. The king's face darkened with fury. He descended the 3 steps from his throne with deliberate slowness, each footfall echoing ominously through the suddenly silent hall. When he reached Ilara, he circled her like a predator, his breath hot against her neck. "You forget yourself," he hissed, low enough that only she could hear. "You are nothing here, less than nothing. A vessel soon to be discarded if you fail to fulfill your purpose." Ilara's throat constricted, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "And what of their purpose?" she asked quietly. "Your children, denied even the comfort of your acknowledgement." Something flickered in the king's eyes. Not compassion, but perhaps uncertainty. He had not expected resistance from this woman he had so thoroughly humiliated. "They are mistakes," he said, raising his voice for the benefit of the court. "Regrettable evidence of youthful indiscretions. Nothing more." Eleanor's soft sob cut through the tension like a knife. The sound seemed to penetrate even the king's hardened exterior, for he glanced toward the children with an expression Alara couldn't quite read. "Send them away," Lady Beatrice interjected smoothly. "To a monastery, perhaps. Or better yet, apprentice them to merchants in a distant town. They've caused enough disruption here." Panic flared in Alara's chest. She had expected punishment for herself, but not this. Not the banishment of these children who had already lost so much. Thomas stood straighter at Lady Beatrice's words, his jaw set in a determined line that mirrored his father's, though he likely didn't realize it. Eleanor simply crumpled, her small shoulders caving inward, as if trying to make herself disappear. "Your Majesty," Alara said, fighting to keep her voice from breaking, "I beg you to reconsider. They have committed no crime." "Their existence is crime enough," Lady Beatrice snapped. "Constant reminders of royal indiscretion." The king's expression hardened. "Lady Beatrice speaks wisely. The children will be sent away at first light tomorrow." Alara felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. In the span of a single day, she would lose the only genuine connection she had found in this cold castle. Thomas and Eleanor would be cast into an uncertain future, separated from each other and from the only semblance of care they had known. "And as for you," the king continued, turning back to Alara, "consider this your final warning. Your duty is to produce legitimate heirs, not to meddle in matters that don't concern you. Fail in this, or step beyond your place again, and you will find yourself set aside, regardless of the political consequences." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. To be set aside, publicly rejected, stripped of even the empty title that protected her, would mean complete ruin. Yet in that moment, staring into the king's cold eyes, Alara found she feared the loss of the children more than her own disgrace. "I understand, Your Majesty," she said, dropping into a curtsy so deep her knees nearly touched the stone floor. The king nodded curtly, satisfied by her apparent submission. "Return to your chambers. You will remain there until I decide otherwise." As guards moved to escort her from the hall, Alara risked one last glance toward Thomas and Eleanor. The boy's eyes met hers, conveying a silent message of determination that belied his years. Whatever happened tomorrow, he would not accept defeat easily. Eleanor's tear-stained face was harder to bear. The child had already lost so much, and now would lose the one person who had shown her kindness. The walk back to her chambers felt endless. Once the heavy door closed behind her, Alara pressed her forehead against the cold stone wall, finally allowing her tears to fall. The children's fate seemed sealed, and she was powerless to change it. Hours passed as she paced the confines of her room, mind racing for solutions where none seemed possible. The castle gradually quieted as evening fell. Through her narrow window, she watched torches being lit in the courtyard below, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. A soft scratching at her door froze her in place. It came again, too gentle to be a guard or servant. "Who's there?" she whispered, approaching the door cautiously. "It's us," came Thomas's barely audible reply. "Let us in quickly." Alara opened the door just wide enough for the children to slip through, then secured it behind them. They stood before her, breathless and wide-eyed. "How did you escape your guards?" she asked, kneeling to embrace them. "The changing of the watch," Thomas explained, his voice steady despite his obvious fear. "They left us with Matron Agnes, but she drank too much wine at dinner and fell asleep." Eleanor clung to Alara's dress, her small body trembling. "They're sending us away tomorrow," she whispered. "Thomas says they'll separate us." "I won't let that happen," Alara promised, though she had no idea how to keep such a vow. Thomas squared his shoulders, suddenly looking far older than his 8 years. "We came to say goodbye," he said, "and to give you something." From inside his ragged tunic, he withdrew a folded piece of parchment. Alara recognized it as higher quality than the scrap he had given her earlier. This was proper writing material, likely stolen from some nobleman's desk. "We can't write proper," Thomas admitted, "but we made this for you, Eleanor nodded eagerly. I helped with the drawing part. Alara unfolded the parchment with trembling fingers. In childish script, with letters of uneven size, were written the words, "We choose you." Below, a simple drawing showed 3 figures standing together, the 2 smaller ones holding the hand of the taller one. The love evident in this humble offering made Alara's heart swell and break simultaneously. "I'll keep it forever," she whispered, pressing the parchment to her heart. Eleanor's face crumpled. "But we won't be here forever. They're sending us away." The finality in the child's voice sparked something within Alara, a determination that overrode caution and fear. "Listen to me," she said, holding both children by their shoulders. "Whatever happens tomorrow, know this. You are not mistakes. You are not shameful secrets. You are children worthy of love and protection, and I will never, ever forget you." Thomas's eyes searched her face. "Will you be all right, after we're gone?" The question stunned her. Even facing his own uncertain fate, the boy was concerned for her welfare. "I survived before you came into my life," she assured him, though the thought of returning to that lonely existence made her chest ache. "I'll survive after." Eleanor threw her arms around Alara's neck. "I wish you were our mother," she whispered. The words pierced Alara's heart like an arrow. In another life, another world, perhaps she could have been. In this one, she could offer nothing but temporary comfort and the promise of remembrance. "It's almost curfew," Thomas said reluctantly. "We have to go back before they notice we're missing. The punishment will be worse if they catch us again." Alara nodded, though every instinct screamed at her to hold them close, to never let them go. She pressed a kiss to each of their foreheads, a blessing and a farewell. "Be brave," she whispered, "and know that someone in this world chooses you too." After they slipped away, Alara placed their drawing carefully beneath her pillow. Tomorrow, these children would be torn from the only home they had known, meager and cruel as it was, separated from each other, sent to face uncertain futures alone. Unless a half-formed thought took shape in her mind. Dangerous, perhaps impossible, but the only chance they had. If she could not prevent their departure, perhaps she could ensure they at least remained together. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could give them something they had never had. A choice. Determination replaced despair as she began to plan. Dawn broke with a cold gray light that matched Alara's mood as she stood at her chamber window. In the courtyard below, preparations were already underway. 2 small travel packs rested against the stone wall. A cart with a weathered driver waited by the gate, and 4 guards stood at attention. They were taking no chances with the king's bastards today. Alara's fingers closed around the pendant hanging from her neck, her mother's only legacy, a simple silver disc engraved with a protective symbol. She had worn it beneath her clothes since arriving at the castle, a small reminder of her true self amid the crushing weight of her new identity. Now she removed it, wrapping the chain carefully in a scrap of cloth before tucking it into her sleeve. The pendant was the last step in a plan she'd spent the night devising. She had already sewn a small pouch of coins, saved from her meager allowance, into the lining of a cloak. She'd written a letter in her careful hand, explaining who the children were and begging protection for them. All that remained was the opportunity to act. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. "Your Majesty," came a guard's gruff voice, "the king commands your presence in the great hall." Alara smoothed her dress, checking that the hidden treasures remained undetectable. "I'll come at once," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The great hall buzzed with morning activity. Servants hurried to prepare the day's meals while nobles gathered in small clusters, no doubt gossiping about yesterday's scandal. The king sat at the high table, breaking his fast with Lady Beatrice at his side. Their heads were bent together in intimate conversation, her hand occasionally brushing his arm in a proprietary gesture that made Alara's stomach turn. Thomas and Eleanor stood to one side, under the watchful eye of an elderly priest who would escort them to their separate destinations, the boy to a distant monastery, the girl to a merchant household in the coastal towns. They looked impossibly small in travel cloaks that were clearly adult cast-offs, hastily cut down to approximate their size. When Alara entered, Eleanor's face brightened momentarily before the child remembered herself and lowered her eyes. Thomas maintained his stoic expression, but his shoulders straightened slightly at the sight of her. The king looked up with evident displeasure. "I did not expect you to rise so early," he said, his tone making clear she wasn't welcome. Elara dipped into a curtsy. "I wish to bid farewell to the children, Your Majesty." Lady Beatrice's lips curved into a smirk. How touching. The rejected queen, still clinging to her little allies. The king waved a dismissive hand. "Make it quick. The travelers should depart before the morning crowds gather at the gates." Permission granted, however grudgingly, Elara approached Thomas and Eleanor. The priest stepped back, giving them a moment of privacy, though not enough to exchange any meaningful words without being overheard. "I've brought you something for your journey," Elara said loudly enough for all to hear. She removed 2 small cloth-wrapped bundles from her pocket, innocent enough to avoid suspicion. "Bread and honey. The road will be long." As she pressed the parcels into their hands, she leaned close, whispering quickly, "Look inside after you pass the forest crossroads. Keep each other safe." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, understanding passing between them. Eleanor clutched her bundle tightly, her small fingers white with the effort. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Thomas said formally, executing a clumsy bow that nonetheless carried genuine respect. Eleanor couldn't maintain such pretense. She threw her arms around Elara's waist, burying her face in the folds of her dress. "I don't want to go," she sobbed, her voice muffled. The king's chair scraped against the stone floor as he stood abruptly. "Enough of this spectacle," he snapped. "Take them away, Father. Their new lives await." The priest nodded solemnly, placing gentle but firm hands on the children's shoulders. "Come, little ones. The Almighty has a purpose for each soul, even those born into difficult circumstances." As he guided them toward the door, Thomas looked back over his shoulder, his gaze locking with Elara's one last time. In that brief glance, she tried to convey everything she couldn't say aloud. Her sorrow, her care, her hope that they might find a better life than the one this castle had offered them. "Wait!" The king's voice cut through the hall like a blade. Elara's heart stumbled in her chest. Had he noticed something? The priest paused, turning with the children. The king approached slowly, his eyes narrowed as he studied his bastard offspring with new intensity. Elara held her breath, fingers pressing against the hidden letter in her sleeve, praying he wouldn't search the children's meager belongings. "Thomas," he said, addressing his son directly for perhaps the first time, "you have your mother's eyes." The boy stiffened, clearly unprepared for this unexpected acknowledgement. "And you," the king continued, turning to Eleanor. "Her stubborn nature, I think." Eleanor stared up at him, tears still wet on her cheeks, confusion evident in her expression. For one breathless moment, Elara dared to hope. Perhaps some dormant paternal instinct had finally awakened in the king's cold heart. Perhaps he would reconsider, allow them to remain, grant them some small dignity within the castle walls. The moment shattered when the king straightened, his face resuming its mask of indifference. "Ensure they understand their positions," he instructed the priest. "They go with my name unacknowledged. Any claims to royal blood will be treated as treason." And with that, he turned away, dismissing his children from his life with no more ceremony than one might dismiss an unwanted hound. Elara watched, heartbreaking, as the priest ushered Thomas and Eleanor through the great doors and out into the courtyard. Through the high windows she could see them being loaded into the waiting cart, their small figures dwarfed by the wooden sides. "You should be grateful," Lady Beatrice said, appearing at Elara's elbow. "Those brats were a distraction from your true purpose here." Elara turned to face her, no longer bothering to hide her contempt. "And what purpose might that be? To be humiliated daily? To be reminded constantly of my unworthiness?" Lady Beatrice's eyes widened slightly at this unexpected defiance. "To produce a legitimate heir?" she hissed. "Though the king increasingly doubts your ability to accomplish even that simple task." "Perhaps the fault lies not with me," Elara replied quietly, "but with a man who cannot find it in himself to love even his own flesh and blood." The slap came swiftly, Lady Beatrice's ringed hand connecting with Alara's cheek with enough force to snap her head to one side. The hall fell silent, servants freezing in their tasks, nobles turning to stare. "You forget yourself," Lady Beatrice snarled. Alara touched her stinging cheek, feeling the warm wetness of blood where the woman's ring had cut her skin. "No," she replied, her voice carrying in the silent hall. "For the first time since arriving here, I remember who I am." The king watched this exchange with an odd expression. Not anger, as she had expected, but something closer to curiosity. She met his gaze steadily, no longer the frightened bride who had trembled before him at their wedding. "Return to your chambers," he said finally. "We will discuss your insubordination later." Alara bowed her head in apparent submission before turning to leave the hall. As she passed the high windows, she caught one last glimpse of the departing cart, now rolling through the outer gate. Thomas and Eleanor were gone, carrying with them her small gifts. The bread and honey, yes, but also the letter sewn into Thomas's parcel and her mother's pendant wrapped in Eleanor's. The letter directed them to a distant cousin of Ilara's, a woman who had married a prosperous farmer in the northern provinces. It offered enough coins for safe passage and explained who the children were without revealing their royal blood. Merely orphans in need of a home, recommended by the queen herself. Whether they would reach this sanctuary, whether her cousin would honor the request, whether they would even open the parcels before reaching their separate destinations, these questions would haunt her in the days to come. Back in her chambers, Alara sat by the window, watching as the cart disappeared into the distance, becoming a speck on the horizon before vanishing altogether. The enormity of what she had done, defying the king, attempting to redirect the children's fate, settled over her like a shroud. If discovered, the consequences would be severe. Yet regret was nowhere to be found among her tumultuous emotions. For the first time since her shameful wedding day, she had acted according to her own conscience rather than the expectations of others. She had chosen to help those even more powerless than herself, regardless of the cost. As the day wore on, Alara waited for the king's summons, for the discovery of her small rebellion. Each footstep in the corridor made her heart race. Each knock at neighboring doors sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins. Yet no guards came to drag her before the throne. No accusations were leveled. The day passed in an agony of anticipation, and still she remained undisturbed. By nightfall, a different worry had taken hold. Had Thomas and Eleanor opened their parcels? Had they understood her instructions? Or had the priest discovered the hidden gifts and confiscated them? Were they even now being dragged back to the castle in disgrace, their one chance at freedom stolen before it truly began? Alara placed her hand on the windowsill, imagining she could feel the vibrations of the cart's wheels returning over the cobblestone path. "Be safe," she whispered to the darkness. "Be free." When sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed of children running through sunlit fields, their laughter carried on the wind, their faces turned toward a horizon unmarked by castle walls. 3 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Autumn deepened, sending crimson leaves spiraling down from the courtyard trees, while an early frost etched delicate patterns on Alara's window each morning. She moved through the castle like a ghost, performing her duties with mechanical precision, her mind constantly drifting to Thomas and Eleanor. Had they reached their destinations? Had they managed to stay together? The uncertainty gnawed at her like a physical pain. The king had grown watchful in a way that made her skin prickle whenever he entered a room. His eyes followed her movements with calculated intensity, as if searching for evidence of some suspected transgression. They had not spoken of the children since their departure, but their absence hung between them, an unacknowledged wound. On this particular morning, Alara sat alone at her small writing desk, pretending to embroider, while servants bustled about her chambers, changing linens and sweeping floors. In reality, she was listening intently to their whispered conversations, hoping for some scrap of news about the children from the castle's ever-active network of gossip. "Said the northern road is washed out completely," one maid murmured to another. 3 bridges gone in the floods. Alara's heart sank. The northern provinces, where her cousin lived, would be unreachable if the bridges were destroyed. Had Thomas and Eleanor attempted that route? Were they stranded somewhere, or worse? A sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. The servants straightened immediately, their faces composing into careful masks of deference as Lady Beatrice swept into the room without waiting for permission to enter. "Leave us," she commanded the servants, who scurried out with bowed heads. Alone with her nemesis, Elara set aside her needlework and rose to her feet, refusing to remain seated in the woman's presence. "Lady Beatrice," she acknowledged coolly. "To what do I owe this? Pleasure?" The older woman's lips curved into what might have been a smile on a less predatory face. "The king requests your presence. Immediately." Something in her tone sent ice through Elara's veins. "May I ask the reason?" "Oh, I think you know," Lady Beatrice replied, her voice silky with malice. "It seems our king has discovered something quite interesting about his departed bastards." Elara fought to keep her expression neutral, though panic clawed at her throat. "Has he?" "Indeed. And about his deceitful queen." Lady Beatrice moved closer, her perfume, too sweet, almost cloying, filling the space between them. "Did you truly believe no one would notice? That your pathetic attempt at manipulation would go undiscovered?" The room seemed to tilt beneath Elara's feet. Somehow, they knew. About the letter, the pendant, the money. Her desperate attempt to give the children a chance at a better life. She steadied herself against the writing desk, determined not to show weakness. "I've no idea what you're talking about," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Lady Beatrice's laugh was brittle as winter ice. "Then by all means let His Majesty enlighten you." The walk to the throne room felt like a journey to the gallows. Each step brought Elara closer to a reckoning she had known would come eventually. She had gambled and lost, but given the chance, she would make the same choice again. Thomas and Eleanor deserved that much at least. The great doors swung open to reveal not the empty formality of the throne room she had expected, but a scene of unexpected chaos. Nobles crowded the space, their voices raised in a cacophony of shock and speculation. Guards lined the walls, hands resting on sword hilts, faces tense with anticipation. And there, at the center of it all, stood the king, with Thomas and Eleanor at his side. Elara froze in the doorway, her heart stuttering painfully in her chest. The children were alive here, apparently unharmed. Thomas stood straight-backed and solemn, his travel-stained clothes the only evidence of his journey. Eleanor clutched something in her small hand, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Elara. The girl's face transformed with joy. "There she is!" Eleanor cried, breaking free from her brother's restraining hand to rush across the hall. Before anyone could stop her, she had thrown herself into Elara's arms, her thin body trembling with emotion. "We came back," she whispered fiercely. "We chose to come back for you." The throne room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the tableau of the queen embracing the king's bastard child. Elara held Eleanor close, breathing in the dusty scent of her hair, unable to comprehend what was happening. Thomas remained beside the king, but his eyes never left Elara's face, filled with a quiet determination that transcended his years. "Step forward, wife," the king commanded, his voice echoing in the silent hall. With Eleanor's hand clasped tightly in hers, Elara approached the throne. Each step felt like walking through deep water, her limbs heavy with dread and confusion. When she reached the dais, she dropped into a curtsy, pulling Eleanor down beside her. "Rise," the king said, studying her with an inscrutable expression. "It seems we have matters to discuss." Lady Beatrice moved to stand at the king's right hand, her face alight with anticipation of Elara's downfall. "Shall I explain what your bastards have done, your majesty? How they've disgraced your name even further?" The king silenced her with a sharp gesture. "They will speak for themselves." He turned to Thomas. "Tell your story again, boy. Let everyone hear it." Thomas stepped forward, shoulders squared despite the intimidating circle of nobles surrounding him. His voice, though young, carried clearly through the hall. "We were separated at the crossroads," he began. "I was bound for the monastery, Eleanor for the merchant's house. But I remembered what the queen had told us, to look inside our parcels after we passed the forest." He faltered slightly, glancing at Elara. "Inside we found bread and honey, yes, but also coins and a letter." and Eleanor found a silver pendant. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The king's expression darkened. The letter spoke of a place we could go, Thomas continued. A farm in the north where we might be welcome. But the roads were flooded, impassable. He swallowed hard. And then we realized something important. The Queen was alone here, just as we were alone on the road. Eleanor squeezed Alara's hand. We decided to come back, she said, her child's voice clear and determined. We decided to choose her, even if no one else would. The king rose from his throne, his face thunderous. You disobeyed direct orders. You abandoned your assigned places. You returned to this castle uninvited. Yes, Thomas said simply, because she was the only one who ever chose us first. Eleanor nodded vigorously, then did something that drew gasps from the assembled court. She opened her small hand to reveal Alara's silver pendant, the protective symbol gleaming in the torchlight. With deliberate care, she placed it around her own neck, then pulled a folded piece of parchment from inside her tunic. We brought our letter too, she announced, holding it up for all to see, the crude drawing of 3 figures holding hands. To show everyone. Show them what exactly? The king demanded. That we choose her, Thomas said, moving to stand beside Alara and his sister. That she's our mother now, in all the ways that matter. Lady Beatrice laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. How touching. The discarded queen and the unwanted bastards forming their own pathetic little family. But her mockery withered as something unexpected happened. Eleanor stepped forward, holding the parchment up directly to the king's face with a child's disregard for protocol. We choose her, the little girl repeated, each word distinct and unwavering. Why didn't you? The throne room held its collective breath. No one, certainly not a child, not even a legitimate royal child, spoke to the king with such boldness. Guards shifted nervously, hands tightening on weapons. Nobles exchanged glances of scandalized shock. The king stared at his daughter, for she was undeniably his, with the same proud tilt of the chin, the same unflinching directness in her gaze. For a long moment, he said nothing, and in that silence, the power in the room shifted like sand beneath a rising tide. My queen, he said finally, turning to Alara with an expression she had never seen before, not love, certainly, but something like reluctant respect. It seems you have inspired a remarkable loyalty in these children. Not loyalty, Your Majesty, Alara replied quietly. Love. Something freely given and freely returned. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with everything that their marriage lacked. The king's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, the great doors burst open once more. A royal messenger stumbled in, face flushed from running. Your Majesty, urgent news from the northern borders. The king turned, irritation flashing across his features at the interruption. What is it? Rebellion, sire. Lord Devereux has raised an army. They march south even now. The hall erupted into chaos, nobles shouting questions, guards rushing to receive orders. In the confusion, Thomas pressed close to Alara's side. Whatever happens, he whispered urgently, we won't let them separate us again. We have the letter. We have the pendant. We choose you. Eleanor nodded fiercely, her small fingers intertwining with Alara's. Forever, she added with a child's absolute certainty. As the castle mobilized around them, preparing for war, Alara held the children close, their warmth a shield against whatever might come. For the first time since entering this cold castle, she was not alone. For the first time, she had been chosen. The castle transformed overnight into a fortress, preparing for war. Servants scurried through corridors carrying armloads of supplies. Blacksmiths worked through the night repairing armor. And nobles huddled in tense clusters, whispering of alliances and betrayals. Throughout the chaos, the matter of Thomas and Eleanor, and their public declaration, became temporarily overshadowed by more pressing concerns. Alara stood at her chamber window, watching as soldiers assembled in the courtyard below. The early morning light glinted off spearheads and helmets, transforming the gathering men into a sea of cold metal. Thomas pressed against her side, his eyes wide as he observed the military preparations. Will there really be a war? He asked, his voice hushed with a mixture of fear and fascination. I don't know. Ilara replied honestly, resting her hand on his shoulder. Lord Devereux has grievances against your father dating back many years. Perhaps he sees opportunity in the kingdom's current instability. Eleanor sat cross-legged on Ilara's bed, carefully arranging small wooden figures she had found discarded in a storage room, her first real toys. Will they make us leave again? She asked without looking up, her voice deliberately casual in a way that broke Ilara's heart. Even at 6 years old, the girl had learned to brace herself against disappointment. No, Ilara said firmly, turning from the window. No one will separate us again, I promise. The door opened without warning, and the king strode in, flanked by 2 guards. He wore partial armor, a breastplate over his tunic and a sword at his hip, and his face was drawn with the strain of the past 24 hours. He glanced at the children, then fixed his gaze on Ilara. We need to speak, alone. Thomas moved protectively closer to Ilara, while Eleanor scrambled off the bed to stand on her other side. The king's expression flickered with something unreadable as he observed this unified front. It's all right, Ilara told the children gently. Wait here. I'll return shortly. Thomas looked as if he might protest, but settled for a solemn nod. Eleanor was less easily convinced, her small hand clutching Ilara's skirt. You'll come back? She whispered, eyes wide with remembered abandonment. Ilara knelt to meet her gaze directly. Always, she promised, brushing a strand of hair from the child's forehead. I will always come back to you. Satisfied, Eleanor released her grip, and Ilara followed the king from the chamber. He dismissed the guards with a curt gesture once they reached a small antechamber used for private meetings. Alone with her husband for perhaps the first time since their wedding night, a night spent in separate chambers despite the supposed consummation, Ilara felt a strange calm settle over her. Whatever punishment he intended to deliver, she had found something worth enduring it for. The king paced the room, his armor creaking softly with each movement. When he finally spoke, his words were not what she expected. Lord Devereux was once betrothed to your mother. Ilara stared at him, momentarily speechless. Of all the things she had anticipated, accusations, threats, pronouncements of her punishment, this revelation about her own mother was entirely unexpected. What? Before she married your father, the blacksmith, she was promised to Devereux, but broke the engagement to marry for love instead. The king's mouth twisted in a mirthless smile. He never forgave her, or your father, or it seems the crown that allowed such a breach of promise. Ilara's mind raced. Her mother had rarely spoken of her life before marriage, and never of any noble connections. How do you know this? I make it my business to know the histories of those who enter my court. He stopped pacing to face her directly. Including the woman I was forced to marry for political expediency. The bluntness of this statement should have stung, but Ilara was beyond such wounds now. And you're telling me this because Devereux demands you as part of his terms for peace. He claims you as recompense for his lost bride, your mother. The room seemed to tilt beneath Ilara's feet. He wants me in exchange for not attacking the kingdom. He wants you dead, the king corrected coldly. A symbolic execution to avenge his perceived humiliation. The daughter paying for the mother's crime. Horror washed through her, followed quickly by a wave of fierce protectiveness, not for herself, but for Thomas and Eleanor. What would happen to them if she were sacrificed to appease this vengeful lord? And you? She asked, forcing herself to meet the king's gaze steadily. What do you want, your majesty? Something shifted in his expression, a moment of genuine surprise perhaps at her directness, or at the calm with which she faced this death sentence. Contrary to what you might believe, he said slowly, I have no desire to see you executed to satisfy a madman's vendetta. Yet you've made it abundantly clear that I mean nothing to you beyond my potential to provide an heir. She spoke without bitterness, merely stating facts as she understood them. Surely trading an unwanted wife for peace would be politically expedient. The king moved closer, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to step back. She held her ground. You've changed, he observed. The woman who stood trembling before me at our wedding would never speak so boldly. That woman had nothing to fight for, Ilara replied simply. Now I do. Understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of what the children had come to mean to her, and she to them. "They chose you," the king said, an odd note in his voice. "Defied my direct orders, risked punishment, traveled back through dangerous territory, all to return to you. They needed someone who saw them as more than mistakes or embarrassments," Ilara said, unable to keep a hint of accusation from her tone. "Children need to be chosen, Your Majesty, as do queens." The king turned away, moving to the narrow window that overlooked the castle walls. Beyond, the fields stretched toward the horizon where, soon, an enemy army would appear. "I cannot give Devereux what he wants," he said finally, "not because of any personal feeling for you, but because a king who sacrifices his queen to appease a rebel sets a precedent that will destroy the monarchy." Relief washed through Ilara, though she was careful not to show it. "Then there will be war." "There will be war," he confirmed, "and you will need to prepare the children." She frowned. "Prepare them? How?" "By telling them they're leaving again." He turned back to face her, his expression grave. "The castle will not be safe once the siege begins. You must take them north to your cousin's farm." "Yes, I know about that too. The letter you sent with them was intercepted and brought to me before they even reached the crossroads." Shock rendered Ilara momentarily speechless. "You knew? All this time?" The king's smile held no warmth. "I know everything that happens in my kingdom, wife, including the actions of a queen who undermines my authority." "Then why didn't I punish you?" He shrugged, the gesture incongruously casual against the gravity of their conversation. "I was curious to see what would happen, whether the children would follow your instructions or return to the only home they've known." "And now that they've made their choice?" Ilara asked, her heart pounding with hope and fear in equal measure. "Now we find ourselves on the brink of war, with 2 children who need protection and a queen who has proven herself surprisingly resourceful." He moved toward the door, signaling the end of their conversation. "Make ready to depart at first light tomorrow. Take only what you can carry easily. The children's safety and yours depends on speed and secrecy." Ilara stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You're letting us go? Together?" The king paused, his hand on the door latch. For a moment, something like regret flickered across his features. "I will never love you," he said, echoing his declaration from their wedding day. "But perhaps I was hasty in dismissing your worth entirely." It was the closest thing to an apology or acknowledgement that she was likely to ever receive from him. Ilara inclined her head slightly, accepting it for what it was. "Safe travels, wife," the king said as he opened the door. "Should we both survive this conflict, perhaps we will build something more resembling a marriage upon your return." "And the children?" she pressed, unwilling to leave their fate unaddressed. His expression hardened momentarily, then softened in a way she had never witnessed before. "Tell Thomas he has his mother's courage as well as her eyes, and tell Eleanor." He hesitated. "Tell her that sometimes being chosen changes more than just the one who is chosen." With those enigmatic words, he was gone, leaving Ilara alone with spinning thoughts and a future suddenly, drastically altered. She stood motionless for several minutes, absorbing everything that had transpired, before making her way back to her chambers where Thomas and Eleanor waited anxiously. They rushed to her the moment she entered, their faces alive with questions and fears. "Is he sending us away again?" Thomas demanded, his young voice cracking slightly. Ilara gathered them both into her arms, holding them close as she prepared to explain their impending journey. But before she could speak, Eleanor pulled away just enough to look up into her face, eyes wide with determination beyond her years. "It doesn't matter what he says," the little girl declared fiercely. "We still choose you." Thomas nodded in solemn agreement. "Always." In that moment, surrounded by the chaos of a castle preparing for war, faced with a dangerous journey and an uncertain future, Ilara felt a profound peace settle over her heart. She had entered this castle as an unwanted bride, humiliated and alone. She would leave it as someone chosen, someone essential to these 2 brave souls who had risked everything to return to her. No crown, no royal title, no king's approval could match the worth of what they had given her, the simple, profound dignity of being someone's first choice. "And I," she whispered, pressing her forehead gently against theirs. "We'll always, always choose you both in return." Sometimes the most profound love emerges from places where we least expect it. Ilara entered the castle as an unwanted bride, publicly humiliated and utterly alone, yet she found purpose in two children the world had deemed mistakes. In choosing to see their worth when no one else would, she discovered her own strength and forever changed the course of their lives. What would you risk to protect someone who needed you? How far would you go to create a family from the broken pieces life has given you? True royalty isn't measured by crowns or bloodlines, but by the courage to choose compassion when cruelty would be easier. The king could command armies and territories, yet he couldn't recognize the treasure of unconditional love offered by his own children. It takes remarkable strength to declare, "I choose you," in a world that constantly tells us some people are unworthy of being chosen. Perhaps the most powerful act of defiance is sometimes simply to love those others have rejected. If this story touched your heart, remember that we all have the power to be someone's chosen person, to see value where others see flaws, to offer kindness where others show indifference. Share this story with someone who might need to be reminded of their worth today. Subscribe to our channel for more tales that illuminate the forgotten corners of the human experience, and leave a like if Ilara's journey moved you. After all, aren't we all searching for someone who will look at us and say, with complete conviction, "I choose you"?